Wherever you are, wherever you come from, you're welcome at this sacred time and the sacred space that you occupy. I share these opening words by Eric Wickstrom Walker. We come together this morning because there is something that knows we need more than we can find in our absence. More than we can find in our aloneness. We know this instinctively in the depths of ourselves that we need others for the journey of life, even though we guard our independence jealously. So let us celebrate all that makes us unique, yet all that makes us one. And let us dream dreams of all that we can do together.
For our chalice lighting, these words adapted from Janet Parsons. The flame of our chalice this morning is a symbol of the warmth and brightness of our connections. The flame lights our way back together again from our separate lives as it lights our way forward. And now, please join me in our covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Now please join us in our congregational singing. Hymn number 318, We Would Be One.
We would be one as now we join because of greater understanding, of which we are, and all in us is true. We would be one in living for each other, to show to all our new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than what we know today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts away. As one we pledge ourselves to a greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
Okay. I share this morning the story of the Good Samaritan. Kristen Olson could not be with us this morning, so I will be reading that parable from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, Certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, wounded him, and departed him, leaving him for dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at that place, came and looked at him, and passed by the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on him, set him on his beast, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatever else thou spendest more, when I come back, I will repay thee. Which now of these thinkest thou was the neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, He that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, Go and do likewise.
The promise of the Spirit, faith, hope, and love abide, and so every soul is blessed and made whole. The truth of our hearts is our guide. We are answering the call of love. Hands joined together and hearts beat as one. Emboldened by faith, we dare to proclaim we are answering the call of love. A bright new day is dawning, when love will not divide. Reflections of praise in every embrace, fulfilling the one. Emboldened by faith, we dare to proclaim we are answering the call of love. We are answering the call of love.
I'd ask you at this time to join me for a time of meditation, contemplation, and prayer. We recognize in the midst of joy and celebration, there is sadness and mourning. And sometimes the two are intertwined, as when we mourn and at the same time celebrate a life well lived. One such life reported in the Blade recently was Margaret Jane Dienst Erickson, age 99, who passed away from natural causes on June the 28th. The Blade reports Jane lived a long, rich life. She had an intellectual curiosity about the world, people, and events, a fabulous sense of humor, a willingness to embrace new experiences, and even temperament, longtime friends, and a willingness to make new friendships. And this found in last Sunday's New York Times. I was in the midst of an identity crisis brought on by the pressures of graduate school and my approaching 30th birthday, and decided to reconnect with earlier times at Rockaway Beach in Queens. A nutcracker passed by and we chatted, and as he moved on, he passed a young couple with a very young child sprawled on the beach. The nutcracker stooped down, looked upon the little child, and took his hand and said, "Welcome to the earth, baby. We're blessed to have you." Now for a minute of silence. It's not clicking.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow with the wind, rise in the sea. Move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. I have this reading, The Cab Ride. The author is unknown. 20 years ago, I drove a cab for a living. It was a cowboy's life, a life for someone who wanted no boss. What I didn't realize, it was also a ministry. Because I drove the night shift, my cab became a moving confessional. Passengers climbed in, sat behind me in total anonymity, and told me the details of their lives. I encountered people whose lives amazed me, ennobled me, made me laugh, made me weep. But none touched me more than a woman I picked up one late August night. I was responding to a call from a small brick duplex in a quiet part of town. I assumed I was being sent to pick up some partiers, or someone who had a fight with a lover,
or a worker heading to an early shift in a factory in one of the nearby industrial parts of town. When I arrived at 2:30 a.m., the building was dark except for a single light on the ground floor window. Under these circumstances, many drivers would have just honked once and driven away. But I had seen too many impoverished people who depended on taxis as their only means of transportation. And unless a situation spelled of extreme danger, I always went to the door. The passenger might be someone who needed physical assistance. I reasoned to myself, so I walked to the door and knocked. "Just a minute," answered a frail, elderly voice. I could hear something being dragged across the floor. After a long pause, the door opened, and a small woman in her 80s stood before me. She was wearing a print dress, a pillbox hat, well pinned on, like somebody out of a 40s movie. By her side was a small nylon suitcase. The apartment looked as it had not been lived in for years. All the furniture was covered with sheets. There were no there were no clocks on the wall, no knickknacks or utensils on the counters. In the corner was a cardboard box filled with old photos and glassware. "Would you carry my bag out to the car?" she asked. I took the suitcase to the cab and then returned to assist the woman. She took my arm and walked slowly toward the curb. She thanked me for my kindness. "It's nothing," I told her. "I just try to treat my passengers like I would my own mother." "Oh, you're such a good boy," she said. When we got to the cab, she gave me an address and then asked, "Could you drive through downtown?" "Well, it's not my shortest way, ma'am," I replied. "Oh, I don't mind," she says. "I'm in no hurry. I'm on my way to hospice." I looked in the mirror and her eyes were glistening. "I don't have any family left," she continued. "The doctor said I don't have very long to live." I quietly reached over and shut off the meter. "What route would you like to take?" I asked. For the next 2 hours, we drove through the city. She showed me the building where she had once worked as an elevator operator. We drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they were newlyweds. She had me pull up in front of a furniture warehouse that had once been a ballroom where she had gone dancing as a young girl. Sometimes she'd ask me to slow in front of a particular building to a corner and would sit staring for a while and then say nothing. At first hint of sun was creasing the horizon, she suddenly said to me, "I'm tired, let's go now." We drove in silence to the address she had given me. It was a low building like a small convalescent home with a driveway that passed under a portico. 2 orderlies came out to the cab as soon as we pulled up. They were solicitous and intent, watching her every move, and they must have been expecting her. I opened the trunk, took out the small suitcase to the door. The woman was already seated in a wheelchair. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching into her purse. "Nothing," I said. "You have to make a living," she answered. "There are other passengers," I responded. Almost without thinking, I bent and gave her a hug. She held on tightly to me. "You gave an old woman a little moment of joy," she said. "Thank you." I squeezed her hand and then walked into the morning light. Behind me, a door shut. It was a sound of the closing of a life. I didn't pick up any more passengers that shift. I drove aimlessly, lost in thought. For the rest of the day, I could hardly talk. What if the woman had gotten an angry driver or someone who was impatient to end his shift? What if I had refused to take the run or had honked once and then driven away? On a quick review, I don't think that I could have done anything more important in my life. We're conditioned to think that all of our lives revolve around great moments. But great moments often catch us unaware, beautifully wrapped in what others might consider small ones. My sermon today is entitled, "A Connection, Won't You Be My Neighbor?" And the first bad recorded in the Old Testament was not Cain slaying his brother Abel or the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The first bad is in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. where it says, "It is not good that man should be alone." The first bad was loneliness. The importance of not going it alone is found in our nation's history with words like united we stand and e pluribus unum, and closer to us, Unitarian Universalism. Yet we live in a time of unprecedented disunity, polarization in politics, race relations, policing, immigration, environment. As many of you know, the United States is experiencing increasing rates of suicide and drug overdose death rates. So when I learned the Multi-Faith Council had identified loneliness and isolation as an issue it wanted to tackle in 2020, I was interested because of my work in the addiction field. Then came the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, which led me to consider if loneliness and isolation might be related to either of these terrible events, and I believe they are. The coronavirus has had mixed results in terms of isolation and loneliness, increasing it for the already isolated and lonely, decreasing it within families and relationships forced to spend more time together. May have also increased conflict for some relationships that were already under a good deal of stress. But in my neighborhood, I've never seen so many families bicycling together since the virus. This is a good thing that came from a bad thing. What about the murder of George Floyd? Well, the isolation of Blacks and other minorities from educational, housing, employment opportunities has a long history. If anything good could come out of the murder, hopefully it will be an increased awareness and dialogue that will lead to real change in race relations, discrimination, and policing. But returning to loneliness and isolation, it's important to realize that not all lonely people are isolated, and not all isolated people are lonely. A person might feel very lonely in a crowd, and another might welcome an amount of isolation and not feel particularly lonely. After all, it was Thoreau who said he went to the woods to be alone so he could live deliberately. We should also be aware that not all ethnic groups or people within a group are subject to the same amount of loneliness and isolation. For example, Hispanic Americans as a group have been relatively spared these and from whom we might learn something. In thinking more about happiness, loneliness, and isolation, I decided my focus would be on something related. In drug treatment programs, clients are sometimes asked to give the one word, the opposite of addiction. Many will say recovery, sobriety, freedom, all good choices. But many think the best word is connection, because until the addicted person connects with healthy relationships and activities, simply refraining from drug use only is what not to do, not what to do. It is this loss or failure to have ever had healthy connections that is related to increasing rates of suicide and drug overdose death rates, now commonly referred to as deaths of despair, which is a term coined by Nobel Prize winning economist Angus Deaton. I've also have on my title, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" I'll not be talking about Fred Rogers, but it is important to see the connection between loneliness, isolation, and the increasing loss of neighborliness in this country. That simply by interacting with our neighbors, we can go a long way to reducing the problem. But not everybody agrees that death to despair are the whole story. Noah Smith in a January Blade op-ed and Steven Pinker in his 2018 book, Enlightenment Now, paint a far rosier picture of life in the, for increasing numbers in the last half of the 20th and first decades of the 21st century. While it's hard to argue with their statistics that in many ways the world is a much better place to live, they ignore the fact that some social problems remain unacceptably high, or others have become substantially worse. While many of us are wealthier, more informed, more connected, electronically at least, than ever, increasing numbers are unhappier, less fulfilled, more isolated, reflecting the evaporation of what sociologists call social capital. This refers to factors found in healthy, functioning social groups, such as interpersonal relationships, sense of shared identity, shared norms and values, trust, cooperation, and reciprocity. My goal this morning is threefold. First, to share some recent research about several disturbing trends in the United States that indicate the chances life chances of many, especially minorities and members of the lower and working class, have steadily worsened and tie much of this to the loss of healthy personal connections. Second, to identify some likely contributors, and third, to offer some possible solutions. Many commentators are saying the United States is in the midst of an epidemic of loneliness. Others say it's a trend. Here is the recent research to support it as at least a trend, beginning with happiness. Study just published since the coronavirus, but before the Floyd murder, found that 14% of American adults say they are very happy, down from 31% that said the same in 2018. That same year, 2018, 23% said they had often felt isolated in recent weeks. Now 50% said they often felt isolated in recent weeks. The World Happiness Report is an annual landmark survey of 156 countries on their citizens' perception of how happy they see themselves. Here are the 5 happiest nations from 2016 to 2018. Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and the Netherlands. Here's the next 5. Sweden, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Do you recognize any patterns here? Well, 2 good answers are many are Scandinavian countries and considered democratic socialist. How did the United States rank? We were number 19, which is not bad out of 156, but the US was also among the nations that declined in happiness in recent years. That included Venezuela and Syria. No surprises there. Psychiatrist Robert Waldinger in a TED Talk discussed the ongoing research of a 75-year study of happiness of American men. It's too bad I don't know why I didn't include women, but it's the longest longitudinal study of its kind. Here are 3 things the study learned. Number 1, loneliness kills. Physical health, brain functioning, memory declines earlier, and lifespan is shorter for the lonely. Number 2, it's not the number of relationships we have that contribute to happiness and longevity, it's the quality of those relationships. 3, the perception of what leads to happiness for these men over time changed from being rich and successful in their youth to quality relationships as they aged. Contributing to loneliness is the rising percent of single-person households in the United States, increasing from 13% in 1960 to 28% in 2019. And research has found that people who live alone are less likely to make or keep doctor's appointments, less likely to take medication or take it as prescribed, less likely to exercise, and less likely to eat a healthy diet. Next to lifespan. The average length of time a person is expected to live until recent dropped for Americans as it increased worldwide. U.S. life expectancy in 2020 is given as 78.9 years. It increased for nearly 10 years over the last half century, but the pace slowed and plateaued in 2015, dropping for 3 consecutive years until 2018 when it rebounded slightly. Much of the drop can be attributed to correlates of unhappiness and loneliness and lack of healthy connections, such as fatal drug overdose, suicide, obesity, hypertension, and yet the United States spends more per capita on healthcare than any nation in the world. This suggests that money cannot buy longevity. Not surprisingly, the 10 happiest nations in the world I just mentioned are among the top 20 for life expectancy. On to suicide. Centers for Disease Control listed suicide as the 10th leading cause of death in the United States in 2017, and the 2nd leading cause for individuals between 10 and 34 years of age. Among the many factors attributed to the rise in suicide was a growing sense of disconnection, isolation, and loneliness, what Professor Clay Routledge calls a crisis of meaninglessness or purpose to one's life. Incidentally, this can help us understand drug addiction overdose death rates, which many, in fact, are suicides. A March 8th New York Times article presented the findings of Angus Deaton and his wife Ann Case in their book, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. They found that in recent years, deaths of despair have been surging among white Americans, and especially those without college degrees. And they tie much of this to the loss of jobs that provide a sense of meaning and a living wage. The article did not mention the fact that the suicide rate among Black teenagers is rising at a faster rate than for any ethnic group, making the second leading cause of death among Black children between ages 10 and 19. Death by accident being the number one for them as it is for all teens. Let's turn to prescribed psychotropics. These are medications capable of affecting the mind, emotions, and behavior. They include antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, medications, stimulants, mood stabilizers. The U.S. represents roughly 5% of the of the world population, yet studies suggest that we consume anywhere between 50 and 75% of the world's psychotropics. According to the American Psychological Association, in 2008, at least 1 in 10 Americans were on a psychotropic, with a significant increase between 2003 and 2006. Now, that was over 10 years ago. More recently, it's estimated as many as 1 in 6 Americans are on a psychotropic medication. Of antidepressants, specifically, use measured internationally, the United States measured the highest among 24 advanced nations. Now, to be fair, there are many clinical reasons for using these drugs, and those needing them in poor nations often go without. But we have to ask ourselves, how much of this is attributable to the quality and stress of American life in the last half century? Now, for drug use, abuse, and addiction, which receives so much attention locally in Toledo and Ohio, in this part of the nation, the U.S. has one of the world's highest rates of illegal drug and overdose death rates. From 1990 to 2017, the overdose deaths in the United States went from 4.4 to 22 per 100,000 people. Use of opioid medication is higher in the United States than any nation in the world. Again, with 5% of the world's population, we consume 80% of the world's opiate medication. More than 50% higher than Germany, the second highest. A significant portion of illegal drug use began as the use of legal opioid pain medication. For others, it began as a way to escape the isolation, loneliness, and meaninglessness of life Professor Rutledge talked about. Other causes of loneliness and isolation are obesity, hypertension, loss of extended families, dwindling participation in social institutions like churches, athletic leagues, veterans organizations, neighborhood associations, talked about by sociologist Robert Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone, where he argued that participation in civic activities reflects a belief in social efficacy, a social optimism that as members of a group, we can get things done, we can accomplish worthwhile goals, and we can do it together. This belief appears on the wane as there seems to be an increasing turning inward, go it alone, and reluctance to engage in the outside world that has been fueled by recent politics. How can this be? How can this be? We, among the most advanced nation in the world, isn't happiness tied to technological progress and material success? Well, perhaps to a point, but maybe not as much as we're led to believe. Happiness would seem almost impossible in absolute poverty. But what about people relatively well off? Can they be unhappy? The answer is yes. Few of those experiencing deaths of despair are without basic material needs being met. It is not the absence of material needs, but the lack of meaning, purpose, and connection that drives people to despair and deaths of despair. Despite the undeniable progress Pinker and Smith point to, large and growing numbers seem to fail to find the joy that would inoculate them from lives that are meaningless and disconnected. Is it possible we have wrongly defined what progress is and what it means to be human itself? The source of the problem, many believe, are both structural and inherent in our inherent weaknesses and vulnerabilities as humans. Here are 3 structural features of society, at least partly responsible for these disturbing trends. First, 21st century capitalism.
Structural problem, economist Deaton and case point two are changes in capitalism over the last half century. The meaningfulness of working class life seems to have evaporated. Work is the most fundamental anchor of human identity. As an example, what do people often ask us at their first meeting? What do you do? What did you do? Work is at a staggering level of cultural disruption, even more radical than the change from a rural agricultural society to an urban industrial one. People need to be needed, and jobs have provided a sense of meaning and identity for generations. But analysts predict that 50% of paid employment could be automated by current technologies in near decades. While Pinker gives little attention to capitalist economics, he cites a study that finds economic inequality alone is not linked to happiness, at least not in poorer nations. He says, first, it is not absolute poverty beyond a certain point that causes unhappiness, but relative poverty. In wealthy nations like the United States, where there is far less absolute poverty, there is greater visible relative poverty. And here, as Pinker suggests, there's a greater potential for unhappiness because of comparisons made to the more affluent and a greater expectation of prosperity, often expressed in our society through the display of material possessions. While Pinker paints a rosy picture of material and technological advances, he only touches on the unhappiness caused by relative poverty and wealthy, materialistic nations like ours. Second, urbanization. We increasingly live in urban environments. Many wonderful things happen in urban spaces, but there are negatives too. Several months ago, Keith Burris of the Toledo Blade wrote an op-ed on the loss of rural life. He spoke about rural villages like the one he grew up in as idyllic places, where there was a real sense of belonging and community. He mentioned only briefly that these also were places that were inward-looking, gossip mills, and reinforced prejudices about outsiders. He then said, the closest we can come to the rural village today is the neighborhood. I believe he's right. Cities can be rich with cultural opportunities, but cold, anonymous spaces as well. But Burris is right about neighborhoods. Today, urban neighborhoods present the greatest opportunity to develop a sense of belonging and connection. Third, technology. Technology, like science, is neither moral or immoral, ethical or unethical. Its use may be these. Let's take communications. We're in some respects more connected than ever, but what has come to count as being connected has begun displacing methods used from time immemorial. Time was when many American families stocked their minds with the same things: Little League sports, discussion over the dinner table, PTA meetings, dinner parties, veterans organizations, bowling leagues, and of course, houses of worship. Today, participation in youth sports across the board has declined as children gravitate toward electronic diversions. Youth participation also provided opportunities for parents to connect with other parents. In the last quarter of 20th century, the average number of times Americans entertained a gathering in their home, a dinner party or something of that nature, has declined by 50%. How about online socializing? Can this be helpful? Well, studies give mixed results. Some show it can decrease loneliness and increase well-being and help the socially anxious to connect. Others show it can cause loneliness, decrease well-being, and foster a crippling dependence where it becomes much preferred over face-to-face conversation. The answer is it can do both. For those that use online communication with people they are already close to, it increases their sense of connection and well-being. But for those that use it to compensate for being lonely, it often makes them lonelier. Looking at someone's post may make you feel more connected to them, but it does not build intimacy. Americans today are hyper-connected, but in fact disconnected, with polls reporting fewer non-virtual friends than at any point in history. I recall once reading a comment on consumerism that could easily apply to technology. First you own it, later it owns you. Then there is human fallibility. Someone observed that we humans have the capacity of being angels and devils. We're never simply bad or good, but a complex mixture of the harmful and harmful and selfish, helpful and altruistic. Jesus recognized this apparently when he asked the person that had not sinned to cast the first stone. And Lincoln did so when he called upon the better angels of our nature. So we have the capacity to be stone throwers and less than angels. This is where institutions like the state and religion play an important role. We too have, as individuals, have a responsibility to be the change we wish to see in the world. The question and task before us, as I see it, is not how to make America great again, but how to enlarge our vision of group to include all humanity and creation, and do it in a way that creates connections that will not just reduce loneliness, isolation, and deaths of despair, but create the beloved community of Dr. King. So what can be done? At the 2020 Clergy and Faith Leadership Breakfast tables, we're given that very question. Here are some responses with a few additions of my own. And thankfully, some of these are being responded to within our own congregation. We need a national discussion about values, priorities, and goals in America, and Americans should be about in the 21st century. Cities and neighborhoods should be designed to create more opportunities for social interaction. There needs to be reliable and affordable transportation for people to access social functions. We need to identify and connect with members of groups at risk for isolation and loneliness. We need to recruit and train more seniors to tutor and work with youth. We need to continue building multi-faith bridges. We need to better utilize houses of worship and libraries as natural gathering places for activities, supports, and services. Houses of worship have a moral responsibility not only to their congregants, but the neighborhoods they reside in. Someone said at this meeting, we should make it a point to know the neighbors in our hood. A good start for us would be a closer relationship with a neighbor in our hood, New Psalmist. There needs to be continued development of community gardens and help for those wishing to start them. We need to acknowledge and greet people we meet and make sure that those who enter our houses of worship are welcomed warmly. Wealthier congregations should partner with congregations in school and economically depressed areas. And to do this, we need to be good listeners and engage others on equal terms and not as knowing what's best for them. We need to be preparing for a radical change in the meaning of work and how people will occupy time in ways that give meaning and connection. Some research suggests that having a pet decreases loneliness. And the loneliness problem in England led to it creating a position of minister for loneliness. This is something the United States must consider. Finally, we should realize that we are all first responders when it comes to providing to the lonely and isolated, and that as Unitarian Universalists, we are specially charged to be the change we wish to be and see in the world. May it be so. Amen. We now come to the offering portion of our service. And this morning I would challenge each of us to consider the value of a liberal faith, a faith that is inclusive, not exclusive, one that emphasizes creeds over deeds, a faith that welcomes the lonely and isolated. We are reminded too that while the lives of many of us are on pause, the life of the church goes on. Bills must be paid, programming continues, staff is expected to carry out its duties. There are many ways you can give your financial support. And if I can bring the screen up here, if it can be shown, it gives us options. I am bringing it up. Okay, so am I backing
That's
up
our
here?
address,
All
yeah.
right, there we go. Go to click on and give, then click on the online giving. You can also, of course, give through the mail, through checks through the mail. All are greatly appreciated and will continue to further the work and the mission of this church. Coming soon. Next Sunday at 10 a.m. for Spiritual Adventures, James Forbish, Education Director at Nature's Nursery, will help us learn about wildlife living in our own backyard. Nature's Nursery tends to over 3,000 hurt, injured, or orphaned animals each year. Then at the 11 a.m. worship hour, the sermon entitled Make Them Hear You will be by guest minister, the Reverend Jeffrey B. Gambley. Prior to walking into an extrajudicial execution, Cole House Walker in the play Ragtime exhorts his friends to tell the challenges of Black life in America. The service includes a little Broadway, Dr. King quotes, and a challenge or two. Reverend Gambley of Westerville, Ohio, gave the sermon at Reverend Tim's ordination service in 2017. You won't want to miss this. Immediately after today's service, 12:45 until 12:45 p.m., please join us for the coffee hour on Zoom.
Thank you so much, Joe. Lovely sermon. Oh my goodness. Our closing words are by Kathy A. Huff. Our time may have ended, but our connection to each other and this community remains. Together, may we walk the path of justice, speak words of love, live selfless deeds, trod gently upon the earth, and fill the world with compassion. And as Joe extinguishes the flame, we have extinguished our flame, but not our hope, and work for a world of peace, justice, and community. And now we have Bonnie Rowe remotely.